Welcome to Neurodivergent Faith, a podcast to help you navigate the beautiful and complicated intersection of neurodivergence and Christian faith and practice. Whether you're neurodivergent yourself, or you're a friend, family member, or church leader seeking to understand more about the neurodivergent Christian experience, you're in the right place. My name's Josh Davis. I'm autistic, ADHD, a spiritual director, and an ordained pastor, and I'm delighted to have you join me as we explore the unique ways neurodivergent people experience God, worship, community, and scripture, along with special interests, sensory and attention differences, social and communication challenges, and much more. Together, we'll break down barriers, confront misconceptions and assumptions, and celebrate the beautiful diversity of God's creation in all of us. So, if you're ready to think deeply and creatively, to reconcile your faith and your brain wiring, or you just want to hear what it sounds like when neurodivergence and Christianity have a conversation, come on in. It's a bit messy, definitely interesting, and we wouldn't have it any other way. We don't do small talk here, so let's jump into something real, raw, and robust. Are you ready? Take a deep breath, hold it, and let it out with a sigh. All right, here we go. Well, welcome back, everyone. You're in season 3 here of Neurodivergent Faith, and I'm really glad that you have decided to tune in. And I'm joined today by Harrison Litzell. He and I had a conversation last season about autism and the glory of God. You might want to check that episode out. I've gone back and listened to it several times just because I really enjoyed our conversation. And I'm really glad that you're back with us, Harrison. Thanks for being back.
Yeah, I'm really excited to be here. I have also reflected back on that conversation, and I think just you and I were just kind of thinking about the idea of like having neurodivergent conversations about neurodivergence and like having autistic conversations about autism. I think in my work so often I am talking to neurotypical people about autism, and it is always a joy and a place of connection and rest to be able to have these conversations with you and to explore these ideas with you. So I'm really happy to be here.
I'm glad that you're here too. And today we're talking about masking. This is part of a series that we're going to do on masking. And as a late diagnosed autistic person myself, I didn't even realize I was masking most of my life. I thought I was just doing what all humans did. And it wasn't until I took the CAT-Q assessment as part of my autism assessment process that I realized, wait a second, you mean everybody isn't doing this? You mean everybody isn't constantly monitoring their facial expressions or their tone of voice or their body posture? Everybody isn't scripting ahead or borrowing words from books or movies that we've studied or whatnot. So I'm curious for you, you're also late identified autistic. What has masking been like for you? How would you talk about it from your own experience?
Yeah, I really resonate with what you just said of like, I think I've thought for a long time that this was just the way that everybody experienced the world, in a way that everybody was monitoring themselves and their language and their posture and all those things. And part of that led to me feeling like if the person I'm in conversation with, if they are paying as much attention to their body language as I am paying to mine, then what on earth is going on? Because they're throwing off all kinds of signals that I am not understanding what is happening here. And just to realize, like, oh no, I am monitoring myself in a higher way because I'm trying to achieve something, and this is what I have to do in order to achieve that. And I even my first kind of recognition that that was happening was through conversations around Enneagram. A few years ago, before before I was assessed for autism, I went through some process with Enneagram and kind of really resonated with Enneagram 3 because of its connections with this idea of achievement and presentation and those things. And that was kind of my first place. And since then, with my understanding of autism, I've been like, oh, that's a part of what's going on here too. Part of what I attach to an Enneagram 3 is just this process of masking that is probably related in some ways, but also a little bit different.
Yeah, I can relate to that too. As an Enneagram 2 wing 3, there's this talk of shape shifting, right? And
Mm-hmm.
also as a bicultural person, I know about code switching, and I have lived that and shape shifted to become what the environment needed. But it came really easily for me when I finally moved cross culture when I was 13. It actually came very easy to just pay attention to what everyone else was doing and join in, mirroring their imagery, mirroring their body language and what they did, you know. And then as I reflected back, I thought, oh, it's because that's what I was doing my whole life. Like I don't
Yeah.
remember a time where I wasn't masking around people. And I'm curious, have you thought about how that started for you or where you picked up that you needed to mask?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think um, in a different kind of bicultural experience, I grew up. My parents are both from Florida, but my mom's family comes from kind of a line of physicians and doctors in Sarasota, Florida. And my dad's family comes from a line of cattle farmers in rural North Florida. And so going back and forth between grandparents' houses, right? One of the jokes of my family is that when my parents got married, they got married kind of near my mom's family, and there was like a harpist at their wedding, and just the joke of like, you know, these folks who are cattle ranchers in North Florida coming down, and the first time they've ever seen a harp in their life, you know. And so I think I do have memory of going from one grandparent's house to the next, and even, you know, as a kid on Christmas Day, we used to make that drive from one house to the next, and feeling like, you know, this is a different performance that's going on here, and there's a different way we relate, and also feeling like I was performing in both of those spaces, right? And to feel like, okay, which of these do I really belong in? Because I'm having to perform in both. So which one's real, which one's me, and, you know, kind of having to explore that as well. So that, you know, there's definitely things I can think back on in childhood as well that I can point back to as like, oh, that's a part of what was happening there.
Being from Florida myself, I can attest to the reality that Sarasota and rural North Florida are two totally different cultures. In fact,
Yeah.
uh, Sarasota is not the South.
Right. Oh
It's
no.
very
Yeah.
Southern in terms of geography, but not in terms of culture. But North Florida is more Southern in culture.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, and that brings up the point that at some level, all humans mask, right? We play roles, we perform. The way we might talk to our bosses is different than the way we would talk to our friends versus the way we would talk to our grandparents. Like there's some level of that for every human, but for neurodivergent people, um, we are often hiding our neurodivergent traits. Maybe for fear of ostracization, or maybe because of shame, or maybe because we can just perceive that that's not welcome. And then we're also creating all of these internal workarounds to seem as neurotypical as possible when we're actually not. We're not do the process internally is not neurotypical, but we do all of this moving and twisting and
Hmm.
translating and then try to put it out as neurotypical as possible. You've been doing some thinking lately about belonging and relationship with God and relationship with others and
Hmm.
how those are actually really connected. So I'd love for us to have a conversation around masking and community and masking and theology. What are your thoughts as you think about, and you've been researching, how our relationship with others and how our relationship with God interact with one another?
Yeah. One of the things that I often share when I'm thinking about children's ministry specifically is there's this really fantastic study that was done in children's ministry by a scholar named Heather Ingersoll. And she did the study on the idea of relatedness. And what she found was through qualitative study that the way that a child in church feels related to non family members of their faith community, and her idea of relatedness was being known, cared for, and loved, that feeling that they had from people in their faith community was directly correlated to the way a child felt in relationship to God. So if a child felt like they were known, cared for, and loved by members of their faith community, then it was easier for them to feel known, cared for, and loved by God. If a child did not feel known, cared for, and loved by their faith community, it was harder for them to feel known, cared for, and loved by God. that's what comes to my mind is the idea of, for any of us, if we are in community and we feel like in order to be in this community we have to mask or we have to perform, or that there's a gap between our true selves and how this community understands us to be, um, that especially when we do that in faith spaces, that it is going to impact the way we view our relationship with God. That if we, anytime we are in church, we feel like we have to mask, it is near impossible for that to not impact the way that we relate to God. Um, and especially in childhood, it will have an impact on the way that we understand how God cares for us, or if God cares for us, if we get those feelings from members of our community. So I think there's a really strong correlation between those two realities.
Wow, that brings up a lot in me, trying to figure out which string to pull. But this idea of feeling known, cared for, and loved. I grew up in church, and my dad was one of the pastors on staff. And looking back, I felt like my performance of myself was known, cared for, and
Mm-hmm.
loved. But there was this buffer or barrier to actually my true self being known, cared for, and loved, because I didn't feel safe for whatever reason to be my true self in any space. So even as an adult, as I grew up, I didn't unmask with anyone because I didn't know I was masking. I had just developed these traits and these behaviors and just this way of being in the world that I thought was the right way to be. And I thought everybody was doing it. So I didn't think I was being disingenuous. I thought we were all just trying to show up as the best possible version of ourselves that we could. And I realized that that really kept me from feeling that I was actually loved. I felt like people loved what I was offering. They loved my performance. They loved what they could get from me. Um, they loved how I made them feel, but me, myself, wasn't showing up. So I had no
Yeah.
chance of being loved.
Very similarly to that, I have found the kind of other side of that to be true as well. Of, I was going to those spaces, I thought we were all performing, and any time that I would try to have a conversation about like, hey, it's crazy that we're performing, and somebody else would be like, I'm not performing, the way that I would interpret that is, oh, we're lying about this. Like, not only are we performing, but we're gonna lie about the fact that we're performing. And so it like developed this distrust that I had of other people, because I thought we all have this thing going on inside of our brains, and if you're not willing to admit it, I guess we just don't talk about it. And so what that then taught me was, okay, not only do I have to perform, but then I have to deny that I'm performing if it ever comes up, because that's apparently what we do. And it's been like recently that I've begun to kind of unpack that, of like, oh, that was a part of what was building this kind of space, was not only the fact that I felt like people didn't see me for my true self, but I heard their reaction to this idea of performance, rather than saying, oh, I'm different and this is something that's different that's happening. I heard it as a, you're not going to admit this to me, and so I don't, you don't want to share that part of yourself with me, and built space in there as well. So like this double layer of distance.
And then you're saying that from this research you've done, it's clear that that also connects to our relationship with God. And for me, that was true. It wasn't until 2021 where I took about a month and I walked by myself in Spain. Didn't know it at the time, but now looking back, I was completely unmasked for a month because I
Mm,
wasn't around anyone
mm,
for the vast part of the day. And I wasn't around anyone for the entire month that had ever met me before.
yeah.
So my face just did what it normally does. I was able to just feel my own body and like how I actually felt in different situations. And that was a powerful month for me in terms of becoming a friend to myself and also beginning to experience this more face-to-face relationship with God, where I wasn't showing up to God with a mask either.
Hmm.
How have you processed some of that for yourself in terms of your relationship with God and masking?
Yeah, I think a part of it has been this like recognition that if there are aspects of spiritual practice or aspects of worship that I feel disconnected from, that it's not because I've done something wrong. It's not because I'm bad at worship or I'm bad at the spiritual practice, but that it is okay to find other ways to connect, other ways to relate, and to like give myself that space, and to also then again, kind of on the other side of that, to say, oh, this kind of this aspect of worship is difficult for me, and so I'm going to give myself space from it. But this aspect of spiritual practice or this aspect of faith is really helpful and really connects me. So I'm going to seek that out more and make sure that I'm intentional about finding that. And just again, to just have that ability to do that and to know, to begin to feel, as you said, to begin to find what it feels like to unmask in helpful and healthy ways, and to know this is something I want to be a part of my faith practice. This is something I want to be a part of my faith community. And so if I'm going to be in a space, I need to be able to find some way to do this. And if it's not possible in that space, then it might not be the community for me. Or, if it is a community where I can do this, making sure I'm finding times and opportunities to be authentic and to be myself in that place.
I'd like to explore more with you in a minute about if it's not possible in that space and how we might discern. But first, you talked about this kind of relieving of the pressure and kind of untangling from shame to say, okay, this spiritual practice doesn't work for me. That doesn't necessarily mean I'm doing it wrong or I am a bad person. Or I'm less spiritual than someone else. How did you come to that work? Because a lot of people, myself included, we get stuck in shame for a long time,
Mm-hmm.
and it can be hard to untangle.
It's the place of having my professional and personal life both being tied up in church, right? I find myself in church on a Sunday, sometimes personally, sometimes professionally, sometimes a little bit of both. And to recognize the ways that that was impacting me, of how do I show up in a church when I'm here for my job, and what does that feel like? How do I show up to church when I'm here with my family or by myself, and what does that feel like? And then because I was already able to kind of recognize the space between those two realities, it kind of invited me into exploring it further. And I think it was because of some of the work that I'm doing where I'm, asking these questions in different communities with different people of what is worship? Why do we worship? What are our objectives of worship? And to be able to have that conversation over and over, and then to be in a worship space and be like, oh, I'm not meeting those objectives that I just talked about with somebody of like, this is why we worship. And those aren't happening for me right now. When was the last time that I felt that happening? Oh, it was in this place. Okay, how do I explore that more? And so I think it is like, because so much of my life is wrapped up in and around church, it just, I found myself in places to ask those questions. And then, yeah, just like face that shame and like, was like, yeah, I'm feeling shame about this. What do I want to do about that? And I think that that's something I've been working on recently, is recognizing that shame often feels like this like compulsive need to cover something up and to hide it away. And so when I feel that in myself, be like, whoa, 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 okay, let's look at it for a minute. Don't have to do anything about it, but I'm gonna look it in the eyes and see what's there, and then let's go from there. And that's really uncomfortable sometimes, but it can be helpful to just like at least look it in the eyes, see what's there, and then kind of make decisions from there.
I love that so much. For those of you who are listening and that resonates with you, or you feel even a little bit uncomfortable, but kind of also drawn to what Harrison was just saying, I would encourage you to just name it out loud to yourself or in your journal. I'm feeling shame about whatever it is, XYZ, put some words around it, and then say, can I look this in the eye? And you might even, depending on how you relate to God, you might even ask God to be with you as you take a look at this and get curious about what's actually happening. You might find that it's not shame that's actually coming from God, or from what even you actually believe theologically, but it's coming from some other place, social expectations or whatnot. So let's talk about community, because you said if it's not a safe space for me to unmask, then maybe I need to look in a different direction. How do we know, how do we discern when it's safe to unmask with others? Because at least for me, masking was a survival mechanism, a coping mechanism to stay safe. So I conditioned myself to feel like if I wasn't masking, I wasn't safe, right?
Mm.
Um, so it's taken some trial and error, and I'm still in that process of like, how do I discern when it's safe to unmask with others and when it isn't?
I think that one thing that comes to mind, this is something I quote my sister often with this. One of her phrases is to lower the stakes. And that's something that's become like really important to me in community and different spaces is if I'm in a community or if I'm in a church and it feels like every action or every movement or every word is bound up with the weight of eternity. That is really hard, right? Because then I feel I have to be very conscious of every movement, every moment, every word, because it is bound up with the weight of eternity. But if I can lower the stakes and I can recognize that, I mean, I'll just share it from the faith community that I'm a part of now, the church that I go to now. The Sunday that my family joined as members of this church, we were there for worship. My kids, the way this church is structured, we're all together for a little bit at the beginning, and the kids go to kind of children's worship time. And as our kids left to go to children's worship, I could just feel in my body that I was not in a place of worship that morning. It's just not where I was, and I knew that if I tried to sit and muscle through, I was just going to build anxiety. I was going to get kind of wound. It just wasn't going to be good. And so my wife was sitting next to me, and I just tapped her on the shoulder and said, "Hey, I'll be back." And I just walked around the neighborhood. I just went outside and walked. And then my wife, she texted me when it was time to come back for us to be introduced as new members. And so I snuck back in the back door and sat down and stood up to be welcomed as a new member of the church. And that moment for me was like, okay, this is going to work. The fact that I can step out of the worship service because I know this just isn't going to happen today, and I can take care of my body and take care of myself and still join the church, and nobody's going to say, a word sideways about it. That gave me confidence in this community in a really important way, and has continued to just be this like symbol for me of this is what it feels like to be safe here.
Mhm. But if there was any kind of feeling of like you were doing something wrong
Right.
or you were not being a good church member by
Mm-hmm.
stepping out, then that would indicate that you have a lot environmentally to push back on to just even try to be yourself.
Definitely. Definitely.
What about like, I imagine that we are all unmasking or considering unmasking around people who also don't know a lot about
Mm-hmm.
neurodivergence, and they may get it wrong, and they may make assumptions that are not true, and they may judge and not realize they're judging. How do we navigate that? And when do we know, okay, I've tried enough and I can't fight this anymore. I need to just set a boundary or move out of this space, or when to keep trying.
Yeah, I think for me, it comes down to the difference between curiosity and judgment. If we're going to have a conversation about autism and you have questions that aren't worded quite right, or maybe you're asking things that I'm not really comfortable sharing, but you're coming to it out of a place of curiosity and care, I will hold my boundaries where I need to hold them. And I will also do my best to respond with care and grace in order to journey together through those conversations. If I feel like those questions or those moments are coming not from a place of curiosity, but instead from a place of judgment, that it's not from wanting to learn, but it's from wanting to distance or to demean, that for me is a pretty quick, all right, we're not doing this. And for me, a lot of that comes into, are you asking to learn or are you asking to distance and to demean? Because I have a good bit of patience when it comes to learning. You know, I'm happy to have those conversations as long as we're coming to them with good intent. And I will assume good intent to start. And if you then kind of prove yourself otherwise, then we'll cross that bridge. But I'll start by assuming the best. And so it really is kind of like somebody has to kind of prove themselves as not wanting to be in that relationship for me to be like, all right, you know what, I'm not going to do this anymore. I'm going to move on.
I always assume positive intent until
Mm-hmm.
I see otherwise. And I just had a conversation this past week with a family member who said, I don't engage a lot with your stuff on social media, but I want you to know that even though I don't fully understand what you're talking about, I'm interested and I'm wanting to learn. And they're in their 70s, and it was just really meaningful to me that they took that posture. And I said, "Thank you. That means a lot." Right. But then I also have experienced a lot of pushback from people. In my own story, the pushback has come from the people who had the most to lose, whether that was to accept difference meant that they had to encounter something in themselves that they didn't want to encounter, or it meant that they had to um, question something that they held really dearly. And I've started to learn that their big reactions or their negative reactions towards me and my unmasking, it's actually never once so far been about me. It's been about them. It's still hard and it's been
Yeah.
painful, you know. But I'm starting to learn, oh, okay, that's about them and where they're at on their journey and what's going on the inside of them.
That recognition of like, oh, there's something else going on here, and I'm gonna need to protect myself from this because you're not in a place to care for me because you've got something going on in yourself. So I'm gonna need to create the distance here that I need to be safe.
Right. And how willing a leader is to hear when they've made a mistake
Mm-hmm.
and when they've said something that was actually offensive or demeaning. How willing a leader is to be uncomfortable and get outside of what they know and what they understand. Those are also cues for me of whether space is safe enough.
One of the things I've been thinking about recently is when somebody learns something new, kind of what their first reaction is whether somebody's able to say, I did not know that, or that reaction that I do this sometimes too, of like the reaction of, yeah, yeah, yeah. It's like, oh, yeah, 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 I knew that. It's like, well, I didn't know that, but I just don't want to be caught out looking like I didn't know something.
Right.
And that's me being defensive, right? Which is prevents me from being able to be curious because now I'm posturing myself in its place of, I already know that, so I don't need you to tell me, which just kind of shuts down the conversation. But instead to find, yeah, especially leaders, especially people in places of authority who are able to say, I didn't know that, or I don't know that. Please share more. That is, yeah, that's a huge thing.
And I find that it's usually coming in myself when I do that, and in others when I've experienced that, it's usually coming from a place of insecurity or
Mm-hmm.
fear or shame. And those are actually all things that are cues that I'm not safe as a
Right.
neurodiverse person in this space.
Yeah.
So one of the best things I think leaders can do is work on their own shame. Look that
Mm-hmm.
shame in the face, like you were talking about earlier. Work on their own fears, their own insecurities. Whether they realize it or not, those things come through in their communications and even in their systems and their structures. And so at one level, like creating safe spaces is an invitation for all of us to find more freedom from fear and from shame. Yeah, it can be actually a gift for a community if they're willing to lean in and receive it.
That's one of my favorite things about the work of inclusion and talking about accessibility is so often we're talking about one area of accessibility in a church or wherever it might be, And it's when we're talking about accessibility for one person or one community, and then it's like, oh, this would actually be helpful for me too, or this would be helpful for this other person too. And it's like, yeah, that's the really cool thing about inclusion and accessibility is once you start going, more and more people are able to join. And sometimes it's intentional, and sometimes you all of a sudden include somebody that you had no idea that they were excluded, but here they are. And just the way that we can see that kind of continue to roll. And yeah, the way that it is a gift for everybody is such a beautiful thing.
I was talking to a church staff earlier today, and one of the topics that we were talking about is just this pressure that so many church leaders feel to perform when they're not feeling it, when things are on fire in their life, when so many different things, right? Still got to show up, put a smile on, and get the job done. And there's this expectation of strength and capability, and always having the right answer for everything that we often put on our church leaders and faith leaders. And for me, becoming aware of my own neurodivergence and beginning to unmask has actually really helped me to recognize my own limitations as a human and as a leader. And still, it's challenging in those spaces where people look to me as a leader
Mhm.
to say, hey, I'm actually feeling completely overwhelmed right now and I need to move my body, or whatever the case might be. Stepping out of a meeting without any kind of long explanation because I can't even access the words until I get to a point of regulation and stim or whatever I need to.
Yeah. It makes me think of a friend of mine who's a pastor here in Atlanta. And I was talking with her. She's a pastor, she's a parent, she is a neurodivergent parent of a neurodivergent child.
Yep.
And so we were talking about that, about being neurodivergent parent. And one of the things that she talked about was just the, as a neurodivergent person who's a parent, the support that she needs to parent. And so I asked, I was like, as a pastor, what is that like to admit those needs, admit those limitations, ask for the supports? And what she said was, she told me that she felt like it was a part of her responsibility as a leader to confess those limitations and ask for supports because that's what being a human means, and people need to see their spiritual leaders do that too. And that was just such a like paradigm shifting idea for me, that the responsibility of the leader is not to be the one without needs, not to be the one without support, but to be the one who models that looks like. That is human. That is something we all need. And so either you're being honest about it, or you're not meeting those needs, which means at some point those needs are going to overtake you and you're going to burn out, or you're going to, like, something's going to go sideways, or you're meeting those needs and you're not telling the truth about it, at which point we're back to the kind of deceptive aspect. And so, yeah, that's something I think about a lot.
Let's poke at that just a minute. Would you say that masking, from your perspective, is always deceptive or inauthentic?
I think the word deceptive has like a moral aspect to it, and so I would reject that because I don't think of masking as a moral decision. Inauthentic. If we're thinking of authenticity as a expression of wholeness, that to be authentic is to be complete, then I think that masking can be inauthentic. But I do think that for me, in my experience, the ways that I mask are still parts of me. I'm just choosing and sculpting which part of me to express and share here. It's not that this isn't who I am,
Mhm.
it's a part of who I am. It's just not all of me. And so in that way, I think I'm arguing semantics a little bit, but I think that would be my response to it. I would resist any idea around masking that would kind of give it a category of moral or immoral, and instead say this is something that people either sometimes need to do or are doing, but it's not something that's created up out of thin air. It's a part of themselves still, just not all of themselves.
Hmm. And would you say that you could have a deep relationship with someone
Mm.
if you couldn't unmask around them?
Oh, I'm going to answer this personally, not prescriptively, and the answer for me is no. Whether or not that's something that all autistic people or masking people would relate to, I don't know, but that's my answer.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
And I would say I can have an authentic relationship with
Hmm.
someone, but not a deep relationship with someone.
Yeah.
So I would say sometimes when I'm masking, I'm being authentic to the level of safety or the level of relationship that I have.
Yeah.
Um, I'm not being deceptive. I'm actually trying to protect not only myself, but also the other people in the room who are not ready or able or wouldn't know what to do with
Yeah.
me showing up in a different way. But in order to feel a true deep relationship and connection with someone, then I would need to be safe unmasking around them.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think that's something I've learned just kind of experientially. Of it's been in recent years that I've kind of built more relationships where I am able to unmask and to be like, oh, this is different. Like this is a new experience, one that I'm not as familiar with. What is happening here? And to recognize that of like, oh, okay, this is something I need in these deep relationships. And I appreciate the kind of space you made there between the idea of a deep relationship and authentic relationship, because I think that's true. I think the people that I mask around, there is still authenticity there. And it is still a piece of myself that I am offering in that relationship and a true piece of myself. It's just not, I'm just kind of calculating which piece to offer there, and holding some other parts back. But that is different from what a true deep unmasked relationship looks like.
Mhm. How do you show up differently, either practically speaking or metaphorically or feeling wise speaking? How do you show up differently in those relationships where you can unmask more freely?
Yeah, I think that in those relationships, there's more just like some of it's just kind of like stereotypical autistic things, right? Of like some of those relationships we just like take turns sharing about our special interests and info dumping, and we like exchange fidgets, all those kinds of things.
Yes.
We set up like quirky timetables of when we're going to meet because it's nice to have these structures and rules around the relationship and all those kinds of things. There's this really interesting idea when we're talking about like the emotional life and the ability of autistic people to understand the emotions and body language of others, right? That there is a gap between the communication style of autistic and non-autistic people.
Mhm.
But what has been found is that autistic people, there is no gap in the way that they're able to connect and relate to one another. The gap is just between autistic and non autistic. So I think that when I'm around people who are specifically other people who are autistic or other people who are neurodivergent, like you can just feel that kind of click of, oh, there's not a space in the way that we relate to one another. There's not a gap in the way that we emote or communicate. And so there's just kind of this rhythm that is hard to find in other places. And just, yeah, the rhythms of our conversation are different. We move to deeper conversations much quicker. We talk about a variety of different things and kind of there's a kind of a level of playfulness that's often there that I don't have in other places.
Yeah, that's good. I recognize I don't feel like I have to apologize for associative thinking in
Hmm.
those kinds of spaces. I don't have to maintain eye contact. I don't have to worry about what they're going to assume about my body language. Um, I feel more freedom to move. I also have really appreciated setting up times for relating to friends, and I have one friend I relate to every Tuesday morning at 6:30, another one
Hmm.
every Wednesday morning at 7 a.m. So having those structured
Hmm.
connection points has been really helpful. And so then putting that back into faith space and connection with God, if I learn in church, for example, that in order to relate to the community of faith, I've got to do relationships in a way that doesn't come naturally for me. I've got to translate all the time, right? Then a lot of us carry that over into our relationship with God. It's like, in order to relate to God's people, it's this. So, in order to relate to God, I must also have to always be translating, never be relating to God in a way that feels natural to me. So, I've actually encouraged some of the people that I work with in spiritual direction who are neurodivergent to info dump in prayer to God, to tell God what they're excited about, what they are curious about. Spend some time just geeking out or nerding out on whatever it is in God's presence, right? Um, Not feel like they have to do this linear approach to prayer or to relationship with God. And maybe there are other ways that they could show up more relationally authentic in their relationship with God. Does that stir any ideas in you or thoughts?
Yeah, yeah, I like that idea, and I like the kind of connection between, how we learn to relate in faith spaces and how we learn to relate to God. Yeah, it makes me think and contemplate, what does it look like, what does it feel like to be fully authentic before God. And I think that in some ways that's one of those questions and practices that are a lifetime of exploration, right? And I think in other ways there are aspects of that question where it is like kind of a starting place of, I kind of talked about how I felt like in my relationship, because of my experience of masking, I thought everybody was doing that. And so it built in this kind of distrust. And so to kind of go back and say, like, okay, well, does that distrust exist with God? Did I have a misunderstanding of the character of God because of this? And then, then you get into the kind of theological side of, three persons and one God, and all those kind of different things. This, kind of explore there as well. But I definitely think there's room there to wonder about and to find more deep authenticity in relationship with God.
Part of my journey is that meeting with my own spiritual director before neurodivergence was even on my radar screen, I sensed God inviting me into a face to face relationship. And I remember saying to God, like, I don't even know what my face would look like. I thought I was supposed to show up to you looking like Jesus.
Mm.
Um, and it was like this invitation from God to find out what my face would actually look like. And that's the journey that set me on to discover my own neurodivergence. As I started to pay attention to how I actually felt and how I actually thought in social situations, I started to recognize, oh, huh, I'm not thinking or experiencing this in the same way that other people talk about their experience. And so then that set me into this research and understanding more. But when you think about masking in scripture, are there any scriptures that come to your mind?
Yeah, that's a good question.
For me, that I think it's Corinthians, we with unveiled faces behold
Mm,
God. I think about that in my own journey. What would it look like for all of us, neurodivergent or not, to behold God without any pretense, without any sense of performing or masking?
yeah. Honestly, the first thing that came to my mind was like just some of the stories of the prophets, like especially Ezekiel. Like they got up to some pretty wild things in order to express the word of God. Um, and just to look back on them and be like, okay, so God knows how to relate to people who relate to the word of God in these like embodied, physical, somewhat bizarre ways.
Yes.
Um, and so what would it look like for me to bring my full self to God unmasked and say, hey, let's like, what is your word, what is your character, what is your will, um and not to feel like I have to mask in order to find that. Just recently I heard somebody talk about describing themselves as their personality as spiky, and they kind of describe themselves as an irritant, I think was their description of the way that they see themselves like towards institutions and things like that. And that's something that I've really been thinking about of like what are the ways in which God can call us to be spiky or an irritant, and finding that that probably is going to involve some unmasking.
Absolutely. Yeah. Could that be some of what God really enjoys and delights in
Mm-hmm.
about who we are? That, man, we can walk into a space and immediately spot the discrepancies and point out that the emperor is not wearing any
Yeah,
clothes. People can be really upset and frustrated, but it's actually irritation that could lead to good things if we would let it, you know.
yeah, yeah, definitely.
Hmm. This is a random question, but you have certain friends that you're like, this is my friend who I like to do this with, or this is
Mm-hmm.
my friend who is an expert on such and such, or this, you have different friends who you appreciate for different reasons. If you were to imagine God saying, Harrison's my
Huh.
in the blank friend, what what could you imagine God saying about you?
Mm. I like to imagine myself and part of what I have felt my calling to be. And so this would be I'm understanding the idea of calling to be almost God saying, Harrison is my fill in the blank type of friend, which I like that idea of calling. There are times when I'm able to see that the emperor has no clothes, and I'm going to stick around in the courtroom and have conversations with other people in the courtroom and be like, "Hey, what have you noticed about the emperor today? What do you think about that shirt? Tell me a little bit about it." And I think that that is something that that's something I feel as my calling to kind of move it out of that the silly metaphor. It's to be that irritant, but to be like a patient irritant, to be someone who's willing to stay in that conversation. And again, like not without limits. Like that curiosity and judgment. There's space there, but to be a patient irritant, I think is where I feel some of my calling, and I would hope that maybe that's how God would introduce me. I want to hear your answer. What is your answer to that?
Hold on, because I'm just like so answer for a second. I love that. Harrison is my patient irritant friend. He's the guy I know I can let into situations, and he'll be gentle. He'll stick with it.
Mm,
I think that image is God for me in some real
mm,
specific ways as you talk about it. And it also pulls me back to what you were saying earlier about those conversations you would have with people in church spaces when you realized you were performing and you thought everyone was performing, and then they would say, no, we're not performing. I think at one level they were being honest, but also you might have been spotting some of the ways that
mm,
they were performing that they didn't even realize, or the ways
yeah.
that they're what they said and what they did were not totally aligned. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, maybe. It might have been. I think a part of what I see in myself is I don't have a lot of decorum around hierarchy, which I think is part of what brings me into the Baptist tradition, right? Of like I just don't have a lot of space for that.
This is a broad generalization, but we just don't do hierarchy. Like
Yeah,
it doesn't
right.
make sense to us.
Yeah. And so I think there were definitely times where like somebody, would come into a space and would have that, and I think I probably would have called that out at sometimes of like, oh, that's a silly little performance you're doing there. Like, what a strut you came in the room with, and they're like, whoa, whoa, whoa. And I'm like, oh, okay, sorry about that. Yeah, I definitely think that's probably a fair assessment.
Hmm. Yeah, you asked me about what might God say about me. I sense that in terms of things we might do together, I sense that God really enjoys spending time with me when I'm making space for another person, and
Mm,
something I don't even try to do it intentionally, but oftentimes I find that I draw people's hearts out or exegete their hearts, and I've often sensed God really enjoys doing that with me, being in that space with me. Yeah, and then I think also just I am starting to sense God's delight in the unique ways that I see the world, and my unwillingness to stop trying to express those somehow, even if it doesn't make sense to anyone and it seems to fall on deaf ears. I think God is delighted with that.
That's good.
As we wrap things up today, what's still pending? Are there any thoughts that are still itching your brain around these topics that you want to bring in?
I think I'm wondering and contemplating what it looks like for a community of people, for a church, for a congregation who is probably going to be a blend of neurodivergent and neurotypical people. What does it look like for them to intentionally make space for people to unmask and to really invite that as a part of who they are as a community? What would be needed to make that happen? Because I think you're right. You said it a little earlier, it's just kind of sometimes those feelings are you get a sense or you intuit this or that. But what might it be for a community to not only communicate that reality, but to live it out? Because I think that that's something that's needed, especially, in my work with children and families too, to think about children who grow up being authentic in faith space and to be known, cared for, and loved, not by their performance, but by their self, I think would be really meaningful.
Yeah, I also wonder how possible it is. I'm an idealist by nature, but I'm trying to be more realistic in my almost 50 years of life now. But I'm wondering how possible it is in a community for everyone
Yeah.
to unmask or at what level.
Mm.
But that said, in answer to your question, one partial answer I would give is I think we've got to learn how to be okay with messiness.
Mm-hmm.
Um, we've got to lay down any idols of efficiency and polished presentation in order for there to be more room for authenticity.
Mm. Yeah, definitely.
And then as leaders, yeah, just firmly believe doing our own work on our fear and our shame and our insecurity and building a tolerance for being uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, I think that's a great discipleship thing that I wish we would do more in our discipling of other people is how can we build our tolerance for discomfort? Not that anyone should be encouraged to stay in discomfort at
Sure.
all, but in order to relate to others with compassion and love and give them room to be authentic,
Yeah.
we're going to have to be uncomfortable at some
Yeah.
level.
Yeah. That's good.
Well, thanks, man. I've enjoyed
Yeah.
it.
Yeah. Me too. Thank you for inviting me and for posing these great questions. I'm definitely going to be thinking about these for a while.
I feel really grateful that you were willing to show up and be so generous with your thoughts. And yeah, this is the first series I'm doing on masking, but I'm already thinking this is probably just going to be a continued conversation over
Sure.
years because for me, even unmasking is a relatively new practice. Thanks for listening to this episode of Neurodivergent Faith. If you like what you heard, consider subscribing, leaving a review, or sharing this with someone who might need to hear it too. And as you continue to wrestle with faith and identity, remember, your unique brain is a part of God's creative genius. Whether it's the way you process scripture, engage with prayer, or connect with others, you are a reflection of the vast creativity of our Creator. May you trust that God knows you, delights in you, and is working in you exactly as you are. And may you know that you are not walking this journey alone. See you next time.